This man could have saved millions of lives when he ran into Adolf Hitler in 1918, but he chose not to. Henry Tandey was Great Britain's most decorated private soldier to survive World War I. And on a cold, foggy morning in 1918, at the end of the 5th Battle of Ypres, he allegedly had Adolf Hitler in his sights, wounded, crawling after a chlorine gas attack, and Henry let history's most infamous villain crawl away to live to see another day. This is the story of two very similar men, Henry Tandey and Adolf Hitler, who had very similar upbringings and whose lives went in two very different directions. This is Obscure History, Episode 1, The Story of Henry Tandey and his decision to spare Adolf Hitler. If you like this type of content, please consider liking the video and subscribing and setting to all notifications. That way you will not miss any episodes as I release them. Without further ado, let's do this thing. Henry Tandey was born in 1891 in Warwickshire, UK, to James and Catherine Tandey, and he was baptized into the Roman Catholic faith, just like Hitler. His father James was an alcoholic. He would regularly brawl with others during his drinking sessions, and many people treated him with caution and gave him a very wide berth. It was said that he got kicked in the head by a horse as a child, and that greatly affected his character and personality. He rarely maintained positive relationships with his peers, and if he lived today, I'm pretty sure he might have been diagnosed with narcissism. And this is where Hitler and Henry's commonalities become eerily fascinating, because Hitler's father was reportedly very similar. He also maintained a very nasty temper. Henry's father James's family issues started when he was rather young. He was allegedly abused by his father, James I, just like Hitler's father, and Henry's father maintained a chip on his shoulder all the way through adulthood. James also grew up in a very wealthy family, and his father believed that James was marrying beneath him when he vowed to wed Catherine. Catherine was also rumored to be pregnant with Henry at the time, before the marriage, which added fuel to the fire and caused more family issues, as you can imagine. Shortly after Henry was born, James became a military man, and he enlisted in the English army in the 16th Lancers and went to join the Boer War in South Africa. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And James's time in the military would harden him even more and turned him into more of a sullen and combative man. But he loved the military, and when he returned from England, he would actually encourage Henry and his two brothers, James III and Samuel, to eventually join as well. Connecting James and Hitler again is both of them had 7 siblings each. Henry was the oldest and Hitler was the 4th. After the Boer War, James worked as a stonemason, following in the footsteps of his father, James I, who was a marble mason, and he was a very renowned marble mason, which is ultimately ironic because his father hated him. When James I died, he left all 10 of his homes, all of his workshops, and his stone yard to his daughters from another marriage. And to add insult to injury, James I left Henry's father only 200 pounds in his will. But not only that, but his older sister Kate was the one who paid it out to him weekly, which infuriated James because he was a grown adult, he had his own family, he managed his own money, so it basically emasculated him to make his sister in charge of these minuscule finances. Around this time, Henry entered the St. Peter's School for Boys from the age of 5 years old, and he stayed there until he was about 14. It was a free school, and apparently it was pretty nice. And now this is when records get a little bit murky. Henry's parents had a rocky marriage by all reports. I mean, I'm pretty sure every marriage was rocky back then, that's just how they worked. But Catherine was listed as the head of household in the census records, and James was regularly nowhere to be found. He was probably too busy drinking or starting fights. What's interesting is Hitler's father was the exact same. He regularly disappeared from his children's lives. The only difference is Hitler's father had ultimately had 3 wives throughout his life, and he was rather promiscuous. He had several affairs, and there is no indication that James did any of that. Regardless, James was largely absent from his children's lives, and people say men were men back then. However, Henry's father James was reportedly rather wealthy by the time he died. I mean, lack of inheritance aside, at least he was providing for his family. Stonemasons back then weren't poor. But what makes this more interesting is that Henry reportedly stayed in an orphanage from the ages of 10 to 16. Now, experts debate whether this actually happened because there were no orphanages nearby at the time. Rumors declared that maybe he was an unruly youth because he didn't get along with his father, and so therefore he was shipped somewhere else. But all indications actually point to him being a good kid with a good head on his shoulders. Either way, somehow he ended up in a workhouse during those years, and so he was a child worker who faced harsh environments with long hours, but he was required to leave the workhouse at age 16, and he eventually became a stoker, where he stoked boilers and supervised a hotel's laundry. Sometime around this time period, his relations with his father worsened, so he changed his name from Tandey with a Y to Tandey with an EY, and then he cut off all contact with his family, at least temporarily. And once again, Hitler did the same thing around the same time period. He also cut off all contact with his family, and he had severe issues with his father. Hitler really wanted to be an artist, and his father said, how about no, Scott? And his father said, you're gonna be a civil servant instead. And Hitler went all emo, became a teenage girl. But Dad, you don't understand me. And so he applied to art school. Ironically, he didn't even pass the entrance exam. I got the feeling that he was rather lazy, and he just kind of wanted everything handed to him. Hitler worked a few menial jobs after that, but he hated his work. Henry also became restless and dissatisfied with his own job. He dreamed greater dreams of grandeur and excitement, and ultimately both of them were just young immature boys who kind of wanted to do something cool with their lives. Rather typical at that age. I mean, I kind of relate. So Henry joined the army in 1910, and he was fueled by the idea of adventure and a desire to get away from all of these family troubles and work troubles. Hitler did not want to serve in the army, and he actually evaded conscription for a long time, but ultimately he was forced to serve in 1914. And once he became a part of the army, he actually got really gung-ho about it, and eventually became fully committed. One of the most stark differences between Hitler and Henry was that Henry saw a lot of combat. Hitler really didn't. He was just a dispatch messenger, or a dispatch runner. But Henry was a war hero. What's even crazier is that Henry was 5'5" and only 119 pounds when he enlisted. So this tiny little dude entered into one of the most grueling wars of all time, and had to deal with some of the worst war conditions in history, and ultimately came out of it a badass. Because World War I was a slugfest, known for multiple stalemates because of that trench warfare. Very early into the campaign, Henry and Hitler's forces would actually meet up for the first time of at least 4 times at the first Battle of Ypres, which was brutal. Henry got there at the very start of the battle. Hitler's regiment arrived a week after it started. But if you thought trench warfare was bad, there were no trenches in this battle. Henry's troops had to dig out shallow holes, scooped out of sand, sometimes hundreds of yards apart. If they became thirsty, they had to go to the nearby ditch along the road, and they would take their handkerchiefs, press it into the mud, and just suck the water out of the mud. To make matters worse, the nearest ration supply drop was 1.5 miles back behind them, and they had to army crawl in the ditch along the one ditch that was along this road to get all the way there and back with the supplies. So that was over 3 miles. So safe to say this was a grueling experience. Henry actually developed a reputation for capturing Germans in this battle and in future battles. He captured his first German when one of them actually snuck into their position and was trying to cut the barbed wire so that Germans could have access through there, and he ended up just running up to him and knocking him out. Could you imagine a 5'5" little dude doing that? I mean, dude was a badass. But survival was really tough in this battle. I mean, Hitler left a forward post mere minutes before it completely exploded. It was struck by an artillery shell, unaliving every single person in the post. So survival odds were not great, but both men did survive the battle unscathed. It was actually the last open warfare battle before trenches became fully implemented, and the casualties were staggering. 40,000 men were unalived in 20 days. I just can't even imagine that. That's just so many losses of lives. And Henry had a lot of friends that passed early in the war, and so he actually learned to kind of not develop friendships with people because it was just so constant. After the first Battle of Ypres, trenches made life more comfortable, but not by much. Between stations, they had long marches with unsuitable boots. Everyone was lice-ridden, and they were constantly passing that to one another. And you were constantly at risk of being shot by a sniper anytime you lifted your head above the trench. So you had to keep your head below ground 24/7. And that persistent fear was just always there in the back of their minds. And because the bodies kept piling up, they would regularly encounter rats feasting on the corpses. And these rats were reportedly as large as cats. And honestly, I've seen some of those in a Chicago alleyway in dumpsters. They're huge, and they're real, and they're freaky, man. So that became a big problem too. Not to mention the boredom and the stalemate effect that came from being in these trenches. At one point, Henry's troops were sneaking up on a German forward position, and a German reportedly yelled out in perfect English, "If you don't stop approaching, we're gonna have to shoot you." And it was meant to be funny. A lot of the soldiers laughed, and that might not make sense in context, considering this is war. But like, you have to understand that both sides knew that the cost of engaging in these types of skirmishes was sometimes rather high and really just not worth it a lot of the time. Progress was rarely progress. And so a lot of times they just backed down from these conflicts and went back to the trenches because that stalemate and that boredom was ultimately a lot safer and better than engaging in skirmishes that were just going to cause a lot of high casualties for very little reward. Henry and Hitler's forces met again in 1916 at the Battle of Ober's Ridge, where the British unsuccessfully attacked another German position. It's actually considered highly possible that Henry's forces shot at Hitler's regiment specifically specifically where Hitler was actually carrying messages between these forward positions. During this battle, the British were actually targeting dispatch messengers, specifically to break down the defense. So Henry's regiment was actively seeking out Hitler without realizing they were actively seeking out Hitler. Later in that same year, in 1916, Henry and Hitler's forces met once again at the Battle of the Somme, which was a multiple-month battle somewhere between June and November that year, and it was a doozy. In that first day alone, 20,000 British soldiers were unalive, which for one day, that's insane. This is also the battle where both Hitler and Henry sustained their first ever wounds at the same time. Henry was shot 3 times, once in the calf and twice in the back of the knee, and he was ultimately lucky to make a full recovery after this one because they did not have the proper medical supplies to treat wounds at that time, and any wound carried with it a massive risk of disease or infection. Hitler's wound was reportedly in the thigh. I don't know if it was a bullet wound or shrapnel or what it was, and both men had to be evacuated from the combat. The only difference was Hitler was only there for 4 days as a dispatch messenger, whereas Henry was in the thick of the battle from the very beginning in June all the way up into October when he was actually wounded. Henry was out of commission for a whole year after that, whereas Hitler came back into the action quickly. What's striking to me is it's just gotta be insane what was going through the heads of these soldiers at this time period. British officers would blow their whistles and men would have to climb up over the trench and charge into hails of machine gun fire. And then imagine you're like in the next wave and you watch the first wave go up over the top and they just get decimated. And you realize that once that whistle blows, like, your life is basically forfeit, and you're essentially about to be mincemeat. I mean, sheesh! People lived these lives, man. I mean, we really don't have it that bad right now. You gotta have some perspective, like, just being in that position, imagine the terror. One soldier reportedly wrote, "The bullets made a horrible hissing noise all around me. Shrapnel shells seemed to rend the sky, and huge shells screamed down on us, shaking the ground under my feet and blowing to pieces both the unalived and wounded. I could hear the sickly thud as bullets collided into my comrades, and every moment I fully expected a bullet to tear through my body." I mean, I can't. Henry recovered from his wounds and fully returned to action in May of 2017 and met for battle again with Hitler for a 3rd time in July at the Battle of Passchendaele, which this campaign was affectionately considered the Campaign of the Mud because it was fought over little more than a swamp. That was it. That was all they were trying to acquire. And the appalling conditions during this battle caused Passchendaele to be considered the most unholy place in Europe because of how bad these conditions affected the morale of the troops. I mean, everything that I just explained to you, it was worse. Men were literally drowning in mud under the weight of their equipment because of how thick the rains were and because of how swampy the ground was. It was said that the men were sometimes more afraid of drowning in the mud than they were of being shot by bullets. The morale was so bad that the men just thought everything was hopeless. They didn't even really have a care in the world anymore, and depression was just running rampant. Once again, Henry was caught in the thick of things in the battle, and he received another wound and repatriation back to England, although the details are scarce on that. Supposedly, Hitler actually got into the thick of battle in this one too, but he escaped unscathed. And this leads me to the 5th Battle of Ypres, which was the 4th and supposedly final time that Henry and Hitler's troops met on the battlefield. And this would actually be Henry's most heroic moment. And I'm about to express this battle to you and how badass this dude was, and they need to make a movie about this dude, because this is sick. The battle took place near the village of Marcoing, and the British ultimately needed to cross this canal, but the Germans had set up multiple machine gun positions on the roofs and attics of several homes near the canal. And Henry at this point was somehow in charge of his specific regiment, so he kind of led the way for his guys, and the Germans were causing so many casualties that these machine gun positions had to be dealt with. So Henry, who was used to this by this point, was crawling on his hands and knees under heavy fire once again, and he ultimately led his team into a neighboring house that allowed them to go up a few floors and get a shot at a machine gun position, and he was able to take out a lot of the resistance with his team. And this paved the way for the British Army to push closer to the canal. And then Henry once again led his regiment up to one of the bridges on the canal, and you have to keep in mind all these bridges were out. They had no way of crossing, so they had to take a bunch of wooden planks and place them on the bridge just to be able to get across. But the Germans were on the other side, and they were still shooting at him from across that way. So Henry, once again, hands and knees, crawling onto the bridge, grabbing planks and putting putting them down over the bridge so that people could ultimately cross amongst heavy machine gun fire. I mean, this just feels hopeless to me, but yet he's still doing this. And he ultimately made the bridge passable under a hail of bullets without getting shot, allowing for the first ever crossing at this vital spot, which ultimately allowed the British to get across in multiple other spots. And these two maneuvers that he pulled were considered two of the most daring maneuvers in the whole war. But Henry was not done. Once they were able to get across the canal and the main force got through, Henry and 8 of his men ended up pushing too far forward, and then they ended up getting themselves completely surrounded by the Germans. And I'm talking an overwhelming amount of Germans. I mean, in this position, they thought that it was hopeless. They were surrounded, they had no way to escape, and they had no backup. During all of this, he was wounded twice, once in the arm and once in the leg, and these wounds were considered rather nasty, and he would face pretty severe hospitalization after this battle. But yet, he still rallied these 8 men, managed to get them up and out of the position that they were in, amongst more machine gun fire, and he led a bayonet charge, reportedly fighting so fiercely that the enemy were completely driven into the hands of his waiting British comrades near the canal, causing them to take 37 prisoners in the process. Now you have to imagine, 8 men, I don't know how many men they were running up against, but 37 of them were ultimately captured, which means these guys were at least outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, maybe 10 to 1, in which case they probably caused several casualties as well. I mean, that is some ballsy maneuvering. That is insane. Dude is literally Superman. But side note, Henry was supposedly very cocky by this point in the war. He once stated that he never thought he could be unalived. Even after all the wounds he kept taking, he kind of thought he was invincible, which I guess I understand that mindset considering all these bullets that are flying past you constantly and somehow you're just never getting hit. And this is probably why it allowed him to do these daring and bold maneuvers that like nobody really expected. And so you can imagine that after this, after a full days of activities, helping his fellow troops out, capturing several Germans, engaging in several firefights, crawling on his hands and knees, that he was probably rather exhausted, and especially because of these 2 wounds, and he was bleeding profusely. But even after the Germans were in full rout, he refused to leave the field of battle. Like, he led parties into dugouts, and he ended up capturing another 20 more of the enemy. And though he was faint from loss of blood, he stayed until the fight was completely over. And this further solidified his reputation as a man who showed extreme courage and bravery, but also a man who showed mercy to his enemy, as he captured so many Germans throughout these multiple battles. And as he and his men delved further into the fog, because a thick fog kind of settled in towards the later end of the day, and they went to try to uncover more German positions, he allegedly came across one young man who was crawling on all fours, completely blinded by a prior chlorine gas attack that had happened earlier in the fight, and Henry reportedly raised his rifle to this young man and shouted for him to surrender, but the man put his hands up and showed he's not a threat, completely blind, and allegedly asked for mercy. I don't know what the words were that were exchanged. Henry, though, being the stand-up guy that he is, lowered his rifle, he nodded at this young man, and he let him crawl away. And he was intent on finding bigger fish to capture. Obviously, he probably wouldn't want to waste his time and priority on a simple dispatch boy. But that dispatch boy happened to be the one and only Adolf Hitler. And that is the story of 2 men that allegedly were destined to meet on that day. 2 very similar men in many different ways. But this is alleged for a reason. It came about by word of mouth, and a lot of that word of mouth came from Hitler himself later before World War II. And Hitler is a known liar, so take it with a grain of salt. But the evidence is somewhat compelling. After the war, a photograph of Henry Tandey carrying a wounded soldier to safety went viral, as much as things can go viral in the 1920s, in the London newspaper. This photo eventually became the inspiration for an Italian artist by the name of Fortunino Matania, who diligently recreated this moment on canvas. And this became a very famous painting that was a symbol of World War I. And in 1938, on the eve of World War II, then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain traveled to Germany to try to come to some sort of understanding with Hitler to try to avoid the war. And as Neville was walking through the halls, he noticed this painting of Henry up on one of the walls in Hitler's study. And Hitler at this time was walking with him, and Neville stopped and commented on the painting, and Hitler was quoted as saying, and this I think is an exact quote, "This man came so near to me that I thought I should never see Germany again. Providence saved from such devilishly accurate fire as those boys were aiming at us. And Henry then would forever go down as the man who spared the life of the worst war criminal in history. Later on, Henry was asked if he remembers sparing Hitler in 1918, and he responded by saying he spared a lot of German soldier lives that day, and so he couldn't really recall for sure Hitler wasn't that memorable at that time period, so I don't know how he would remember anyways. However, the quote stuck, and Henry did come to believe this, that he had actually spared Hitler's life for the rest of his days. He constantly admitted that he regretted that day. If only he had been more ruthless, he could have saved so many lives. But there is controversy with that. Historians debate whether it even happened in 1918, because based on the positioning of the battles and events, it seemed unlikely that the two might have met in the Fifth Battle of Ypres. But they said a higher possibility is that it might have actually happened in 1914 during the First Battle of Ypres, when they were in very much close contact with one another, or even the Battle of Auber's Ridge, where they were considered much more likely to be in close contact with one another. But a lot of them debate if it even happened at all. But in all likelihood, someone probably did spare the life of Hitler at some point. Whether it was truly Henry or not is kind of irrelevant. The interesting part about all of this is that Henry and Hitler lived such similar lives. They both had very troubled upbringings with very problematic relationships with their fathers. They both had very large families that they ultimately isolated themselves from. They both struggled in their younger years to find meaningful work, and so they wanted to leave and find a life of adventure. They both served in the war at the Western Front at the same time period, and they both fought in at least 4 battles against one another. Both were wounded at the Battle of the Somme at the same time for the first time. Both received commendations of bravery throughout this time period, although Henry's were way more impressive. And both were also wounded in the final battle as the war came to a close, and both were also in the hospital at the war's conclusion. But I don't think the moral of the story is that Henry was bad for sparing this unarmed German soldier. That was part of his charm, and the fact that he regretted that his whole life, I think, is unfortunate, because that's what made him into the war hero and the good person that he ultimately was. The real take home here is that Henry and Hitler were such similar people with such similar upbringings. They lived such similar lives, and they faced such similar hardships. But one man took that trauma that he experienced, and he used it to help save lives and make the world a better place, whereas the other went and took that trauma and used it to create a genocide. So the real moral of the story here is, it doesn't really matter the life you live. Everybody goes through trauma, but it's how you take that trauma and find a way to turn it into something good that matters, because we will all face difficulties in life. That's a given. But how we respond to those tragic moments, how we rise from the ashes, is ultimately what is going to determine who we are as people and what sets us apart. So thanks for watching my first ever obscure history video. I thought this was just a very, very fascinating story. I got the majority of the info for this story from a book called One Soldier and Hitler, 1918, The Story of Henry Tandey by David Johnson. It's actually free. You can access it on archive.org. I'll provide the link in the description below. It's a fascinating little 200-page story, and I recommend everybody consider reading it if you liked this story that I've told. There's a lot more detail. Once again, like and subscribe and turn on all notifications if you like this content. I really hope to do a lot more of these. This one was really fun.